In my early 20s, I purchased a brand new sport motorcycle. It was the type made more for race tracks than the street. That's usually what you do when you were young. You buy a fast car or a fast bike as soon as you are old enough and can afford it. In my case, it was a motorcycle. And as soon as I got my arrogant, naive hands on that bike, I rode anywhere and everywhere, every chance I could. One of the most enjoyable rides was from the city where I lived, to the forest wilderness, specifically the Catskill Mountains region. Back then traffic was mostly non-existent once you crossed the Hudson River. My particular journey could be completed in as little as 2.5 hours, shorter if you didn't mind risking a speeding ticket, or the risk of crashing and never making it at all. I made that trip up to the Catskills, and my parents' cabin, more times than I can count. During the day it's a beautiful dreamscape of green grass, wild flowers and mountain views. But what many people fail to realize, is that once the sun drops below the horizon the colorful landscape turns a nightmarish dark. Most of the roads and highways have no street lamps, and on a moonless night, it is insanely dark. If you turn off your headlights you see nothing but pitch blackness. Breaking down would be absolutely horrifying, especially when the road is desolate and the next vehicle might pass only every hour or so. Well, I mentioned how I made the trip up to the mountains often, and on a bike it's usually alone, but I don't think at that time, I ever actually spent the night by myself. Usually my parents or maybe my older siblings would be there, either when I arrived or shortly after. I don't think any of us ever really tried to spend a night alone up there. That place has a way of creeping you out when you're alone with nothing but dark endless wilderness and deserted country roads to look at. It's easy and fun to stay with a group, but even then, once the sun disappears and you step outside, that endless blackness seeps into you, and if you listen carefully you can always just barely hear sounds carried with the wind, sounds you shouldn't hear in the middle of nowhere. Of course there is always the possibility that those sounds are just in your head, your mind playing tricks to freak you out even more. One of those summer nights I was headed up to the cabin on my bike, with my older sister following behind in a rental car she picked up earlier that day. It had to have been sometime after midnight. The roads were completely empty except for us. We decided to detour through the nearest town and loop around to the cabin rather than take the more direct highway route. The town looked deserted and devoid of life, which for that town is normal once the clock hits 9 p.m. The few businesses, mostly gas stations with convenience stores, shut their doors and turn off their lights at 9 p.m., and all the locals seem to do the same. It's as if that is everyone's curfew and bedtime. You could be forgiven for confusing this town for an abandoned ghost town, but by 6 a.m. everyone is up and starting their daily routines. Once you pass the main street through the town the road becomes an unlit country back road again. There aren't any street lamps or porch lights for miles, except for one lone street lamp that marks the intersection of the road and the entrance to an old one-lane suspension bridge, which we had to cross to get to the cabin. After some time as we drove down the road away from the town toward the bridge, we started to become suspicious. We felt we had been traveling far too long, not to have reached the bridge yet. We couldn't have missed the turn onto the bridge, not with that street light acting like a beacon on the otherwise dark road. We continued down the road at a much slower pace now, trying to see the road that was barely being illuminated by our headlights, with nothing but a black void behind us. If we had missed the turnoff for the bridge, we would eventually run back into the highway and know to turn around. I was familiar with this area, I knew the landmarks along the stretch of road between the town and the highway. But at that moment, I felt completely lost and nothing seemed familiar. Eventually we came to a stop along the road, not because we realized we needed to turn back, but because of what we both saw that didn't make any sense. Just a few feet off that major road was a porch with an entrance to a small 2-floor shack. The house might as well have been in the middle of the road. It was so close you could drive right into the front door if you weren't careful. It looked as if it had been abandoned for years, but it shouldn't have been there. We had never seen it before that day. There were no lights on inside, and the house was only visible from the light of our headlights, which illuminated part of the interior through the broken windows. My sister had pulled up alongside my bike and asked,
"What happened to the bridge? Did we pass it?"
All the while staring at the front door of the house, which, oddly seemed to be slightly open as if someone was trying to peek through at us. It was quiet for a moment as we both stared, half expecting the door to bust open, and have some chainsaw-wielding psycho run after us. After a moment, my sister decided to make a quick U-turn while I continued to watch the front door with my bike's headlights pointed straight at it. Once my sister was completely turned around, I quickly followed and we hastily sped away without looking back. After just a few short minutes of driving back, we saw the street lamp and bridge entrance. We crossed the bridge and arrived at the cabin shortly after. The next morning we drove up and down that same stretch of road, looking for that house, but we never found it. I asked some of the locals, but not a single person could verify that there ever was a house on that stretch of road, or built so close to the side of the road. That section of road doesn't have any houses or buildings of any kind on it. To this day I have no explanation for what happened or what we saw. We never turned off that main road and there aren't any side roads to mistakenly turn on. Yet, we both saw a house that wasn't supposed to be there.